Hello everyone, I'm Professor Plink. I respond to various theological and ideological questions and claims from a rationalistic and naturalistic approach in an effort to give and explain the opposite viewpoint and help to balance the conversation. Today's video comes to us from a channel called Premiere on Demand, where Ruth Jackson is attempting to explain apologetics to the youth. Nothing like getting them indoctrinated when they're young, but even at a young age, some skeptic-minded kids might push back against these theistic ideas. So Ruth is taking a scattershot approach to apologetics with this one, by shooting out a bunch of the most common apologetic arguments and techniques in the hope of basically throwing everything against the wall and hoping something sticks.
Fire enough bullets and hope to hit the target.
So let's give Ruth a listen to and see what she's bringing to the potluck.
Can we prove that God exists? Well, it kind of depends what we mean by proof. True proof only exists in maths.
Starting off strong, I see. I've heard this retort from apologists quite a few times before, that real proof is only possible in math, and so when it comes to philosophy or theology, asking for proof of God's existence is a bit foolish to begin with, because only math has definitive proofs. But when you do this, you're really just muddying the waters about the difference between proof and prove. Proof is a noun that means the evidence or argument establishing a fact or truth of a statement. Now, there are different types of proofs, and there are mathematical proofs, and they're quite different from proofs that might be used to say, in a court of law to establish the guilt of a defendant, or logical proofs in a philosophical argument. Prove, on the other hand, is a verb. It means demonstrating the truth or existence of something by evidence or argument. So when you're in a philosophical debate and are asked to prove God's existence, we aren't asking for a theorem or formula kind of proof that you would use in mathematics. We're asking for the evidence or argument that you're using to demonstrate the truth of existence. So don't try to start off by claiming that there are no real proofs outside of math. We didn't ask for a proof for a math problem. We asked you to prove your claim.
I can 100% prove to you that 2 plus 2 is always going to equal 4. But even scientists need a certain amount of faith. In order to even do science, they have to believe that there's an order to the world, that things will react in a certain way because forces like gravity are at work.
I'm sorry, Miss Jackson. That is not faith. Scientists don't have faith that there is an order to the world. We have evidence that there is. We don't have to have faith in gravity. We have measured gravity. We know it happens. We know that any body that has mass gives off a gravitational pull. We can measure this. We have a formula for the gravitational constant of the universe. Faith is the belief in something for which there is no evidence. But there is evidence for the laws of physics and the forces of the universe. There's loads of evidence. Look, you don't have to have faith that if you stick your hand on a red-hot stove that you're going to get burned. You have mountains of evidence that that will be the outcome. And any schlub who goes to put their hand on a stove saying, "You can only have true proofs in math, so there's no reason to think that the stove will burn me. I don't have enough faith to believe that." That person is going to get burned. Now, while science may not have everything there is to know about the order of the universe, the laws of physics, or the 4 fundamental forces of the universe, we may not have all of it figured out, but we certainly do know that they exist, that the universe does work in certain predictable, measurable ways. That means you don't need to have faith in it, because you have evidence for it.
So here are some of those arguments or proofs, if you will. The argument from morality. The idea that we have an inbuilt sense of right and wrong, that we have an instinctive sense, for example, that rape is always wrong. This points us to a law inside of us, which in turn points to a lawgiver, someone outside of ourselves who's put that law inside us.
Argument from morality. Okay, running down the old apologetics checkbook and starting with one of the most common arguments. Frank Turek would be proud of you. All right, so the claim is that we all have a universal moral code inside us. Well, no. No, we don't. There is not a single issue, position, or belief that all people, all over and across all of time, have agreed to. And by that, I don't just mean that there are some scant few outliers who disagree with moral standards that 99.9% of the rest of us understand intuitively. But instead I mean that throughout history, from the earliest days of human civilization all the way up to today, there have been entire societies who disagree adamantly with every single thing that you or I or anyone would assert as a moral standard. Let's use the one that you yourself mentioned. You mentioned rape. That's a fairly easy one to assert as a moral standard that would be universal across all of humanity. I mean, it's a violation of a person's body and autonomy in the most intrusive and malicious of ways. Surely that, of all things, would be something every society can agree to. Except, rape has been normalized, accepted, and used as a tool by many societies throughout history. Even Christian societies, such as when the Crusades were taking place, where rape was excused as a weapon of war. Despite the Crusaders' allegiance to Christian ideals, many Crusaders were promised absolution of their actions taken during their holy war, and that often included the rape of the women in their enemies' cities. And there are many, many more examples of genocidal rape being used throughout history during times of conflict. Not that it happened below the radar, but that it was used as a tool by the military to demoralize and further destroy, even committing genocide against their enemies. It may not have necessarily been considered morally virtuous, but there are more shades of gray, morally speaking, than just awesomely good or detestably bad. And rape has often fallen into those morally gray areas over the millennia. And this isn't even to talk about things like child brides or sexual predation of children that continues to this day in many societies, again, not as an outlier or something done in the shadows, but normalized and accepted as common parts of society. Even if this wasn't the type of rape you were meaning, only the most callous of individuals could claim that these practices constitute anything other than rape. And again, these sorts of things are legal, considered ethical, normal, and in no way immoral in many parts of the world, even today. And the same deep dive into literally any topic or issue you can name will find much the same. That various cultures in society have had intensely different moral conceptions of all of them throughout human history. There are no universal moral standards. The only way to claim that there are is to say that your idea of morality is the true morality, and that anyone who disagrees or goes against it knows that what they're doing is wrong, and they're just going against the law that God wrote on their heart. But that's just egotism. That's thinking that you are totally right and any disagreement is totally wrong because reasons. Humans do not have a common moral law inside them. And no moral law, no moral lawgiver.
Then the aesthetic argument, which is basically just a fancy word for the idea that art and beauty point to something outside of us. A character in a book called Chasing Francis, about a church pastor who loses his faith, says this: "The object of all great art is beauty, and it makes us nostalgic for God." Francis Collins, who's one of the world's leading scientists, used to be an atheist, and the thing that finally convinced him that God existed was looking at a beautiful frozen waterfall.
The argument from beauty. I don't know how the fact that we find various things aesthetically pleasing is supposed to point to the existence of the divine. I mean, for one, there is no universal standard of beauty. If beauty existed as some kind of transcendent thing, a metaphysical urging that defied explanation and thus pointed to something supernatural imposing it, then it should be the same for everyone. We should all view the same things as beautiful. But of course, we don't. One man's trash is another man's treasure, as the saying goes. So what if one man saw a frozen waterfall and found it beautiful? Someone who is, say, hydrophobic, who also hates cold climates, might look at that same waterfall and be made incredibly uncomfortable and uneasy at the very sight of it, because seeing it would stir and trigger those parts of their psyche which are averse to such things. Because that's all any aesthetic assessment is. It's one's psyche, particularly as it pertains to their likes and dislikes, assigning value to something based on the positive emotions it elicits. Neurologists have made great strides in mapping the brain and discovering what is people's aesthetically pleasing preferences and why. There's a wide range of aspects to a piece of art or music that tend to appeal to us on a neurological level. Things like proportion, harmony, symmetry, order, complexity, and balance can all lead us to an emotionally pleasing response to something, thus causing it to label it as beautiful. We find babies, and by extension baby animals, beautiful because we have an evolution-imposed necessity to protect our own young. So we've developed an emotionally positive response to the very aesthetics of babies. We find faces and body types beautiful more often when they comport with having symmetrical features or body features that denote health and vitality, because those factors give an indication of a mate who will provide the strongest and most well-off offspring. So even if you're looking at someone who you are not personally sexually interested in, those evolutionarily imposed standards are hardwired into your brain and thus will cause you to find certain faces or body types beautiful. These are things that we've mapped out exactly how and why they work in the human brain. So claiming they're the cause of a transcendent supernatural being is certainly a dubious claim.
Then you've got the argument from desire. The feeling that there's more to life than this points to the fact that we don't belong here. C.S. Lewis said, "If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world."
The argument from desire. Really, the same problem exists with the argument from beauty. There are no universal standards for desire. Everyone desires different things, and most of those desires can be traced back to biological imperatives. Desires to mate, to procreate, to achieve higher stations within a society, desires to learn and grow as an individual. These are all perfectly explained through evolutionary biology. We've been conditioned through evolution to desire all sorts of things because it makes us more successful as a species. But you seem to be talking about a more metaphysical desire here. You said the feeling that there is more to life than this. More to life than what? More to life than what we see in the world around us every day? More to life than our life cycle of birth, aging, growing and changing all throughout that time, and eventually dying? What exactly is it that you feel is missing? Because there's certainly an entire universe of strange and wondrous things out there that we've barely scratched the surface of understanding. So, yes, there is certainly a heck of a lot more to the whole of existence than what we see in our tiny little corner of the universe. But how does that point to the existence of the supernatural or to a metaphysical God? Why doesn't that just point to the notion that there are lots of planets, galaxies, and experiences out there that are so far removed by distance that you'll never be able to witness them in your lifespan? Why isn't that a sufficient explanation for this feeling that there's something more? Seriously, how did you go from there are things that exist that I'm not experiencing to there is an all-powerful, incorporeal, eternal being who created everything, knows everything, is perfect and benevolent, and will send you to hell if you like someone who has the same downstairs plumbing that you have? I mean, I'm giving this point and argument way more attention and credence than it deserves, frankly. Here's the only real rebuttal I need. You feel that there is more to life and that there's an afterlife, And you can't quantify feeling, so I should just accept it? Well, I feel that there isn't. And you can't quantify a feeling, so you should just accept it.
Then we've got the argument from cosmology, another fancy word which comes from the Greek for world, cosmos, and study, logios. The fact that the existence of the universe points to the existence of a God who created it.
Oh, the cosmological argument. Okay, I am not going through it all over again. I've made a whole video debunking the cosmological argument, so check it out here if you want an in-depth rebuttal of it. But I'll give you an abridged version for the sake of this video. If everything that begins to exist has a cause, and the universe began to exist, then the universe should have a cause. Except that not everything that begins to exist has an apparent cause. The universe cannot be proven to have begun to exist, and it's quite possible and even likely that the universe always existed in some different form. And so it cannot be asserted that the universe had a cause. And even if it could, even if the premises of the cosmological argument were sound, which they're not, it still wouldn't point to anything that could be called a God. It would only point to some cause. That cause could be entirely natural and nothing even close to a supernatural divine being. So, no, the cosmological argument is not a good argument for God. In fact, it's the worst argument for the existence of God.
Then you've got the argument from design. Even atheist scientists talk about the universe being finely tuned. If a tiny change was made in something like the gases in the air or how close the Earth is to the sun, then life would be impossible.
That isn't true. It's really only theists who talk about the universe being finely tuned. And that's because, well, it isn't finely tuned. Let's look at the two things that you cited as examples for fine-tuning. You said if the Earth was even a tiny bit closer to the sun, life couldn't exist. Well, the thing is, the Earth does get closer to and farther away from the sun every year. See, the Earth has an elliptical orbit around the sun, not a perfect circle orbit. That means that there are times of the year when we get closer to the sun than others. At its closest, the sun is 91.4 million miles or 141.7 million kilometers away from us. At its farthest, the sun is 94.5 million miles or 152.1 million kilometers away. That's a difference of about 3 million miles or about 1.7% of our total distance from the sun. So why isn't that enough to utterly destroy all life on the planet? I mean, you said yourself,
if a tiny change was made in something like the gases in the air or how close the Earth is to the sun, then life would be impossible.
Well, I think 1.7% of the total distance to the sun would certainly constitute a tiny change. And yet it has no negative impact on our planet at all. And don't be thinking that that's the reason for the seasons, and we get hot summers when we get closer to the sun and cold winters when we're farther away. The distance has nothing to do with our seasons. That is due to our axial tilt. When the northern hemisphere is tilted towards the sun, we get direct sunlight hitting us straight on. More energy per square inch causes warmer temperatures. When the southern hemisphere is tilted away from the sun, it gets more angled, diffused sunlight. Less energy per square inch causes lower temperatures. The distance from the sun is not what causes temperature changes. And the distance that a planet can be from the sun and still support life is quite a large range. It's called the habitable zone, or the Goldilocks zone, where distance from the sun and other orbital conditions are just right for life. And Earth isn't exactly special by being in that habitable zone. Mars, in fact, is also in the habitable zone of our solar system, and it's 131 million miles away from the sun. That's quite a bit farther from it than we are, yet it still is in the Goldilocks zone. And we've discovered several exoplanets in other solar systems orbiting other stars that are also within the habitable zone. So us being the proper distance from the sun for life to be supported is not exactly special. We aren't even special in our own solar system, which only has 8 planets. So if every solar system of every star has potentially multiple planets within the habitable zone, then there are potentially millions, billions, trillions, even more planets out there that are the proper distance from the sun to support life. That isn't exactly finely tuned. It's commonplace. And then to your second example, changes to the gases in the air. It's true that we humans breathe a mixture of oxygen, nitrogen, with small traces of things like carbon dioxide or hydrogen, and if there was a large shift in those gases, say to a more carbon dioxide-based atmosphere, we'd certainly be in a pickle.
I'm Pickle Rick!
But you know what would do just fine in such an environment? Plants. Plants that breathe carbon dioxide the way that we breathe oxygen. Carbon dioxide aids in photosynthesis, and thus an atmosphere that's heavily carbon dioxide rich would cause plants to grow much larger, stronger, and more vibrant. Also, the gases in the atmosphere wouldn't have as major of an impact on, say, aquatic creatures who breathe underwater rather than air. So, sure, a big change in the gases in the air might be bad for us humans, but it could be perfect for certain other life forms. This point you made displays human centrism in thinking that if something was bad for humans, that means it's bad for life in general. Remember, you didn't say that a change in gases would make human life impossible. You said it would make life impossible, and that is just an incorrect statement. What would be death for humans could be flourishing for other life forms. And even if the atmosphere was changed to something toxic like ammonia, well, there are certain life forms that tolerate or even need ammonia to survive, like nitrifying bacteria. Now, hey, that's not humans, and humans are all we care about, right? But again, you said life, not human life. So even changing the atmosphere to something like a primarily ammonia-based atmosphere would kill most things, but there are some life forms that would thrive in such an environment. And perhaps after millions and millions of years of evolving in an environment just right for them, they could evolve into what might be considered intelligent life. And then they might be sitting around musing that if the gases in their atmosphere were oxygen-based, they wouldn't be able to live. So their ammonia-based atmosphere must have been created and finely tuned just for them. Or they just evolved in that environment, so they're suited to that environment. Not that the environment is suited to them.
And look at how complicated humans are. Could this maybe point to a God who designed us? Isaac Newton said, "In the absence of any other proof, the thumb alone would convince me of God's existence."
The complexity of human biology is something that can and has been explained perfectly through evolution and natural selection. But as to the idea of an all-powerful, all-knowing designer creating us, well, if that's true, he's done a really shoddy job. I mean, there are all sorts of vestigial structures that point heavily to evolution because they're useless in us, but would have been far more useful in our evolutionary ancestors. Like the nictating membrane in our eye. It's a sort of clear second eyelid that's useful in aquatic animals to protect their eyes underwater. We've got the remains of them tucked in the corner of our eye, but we can't use them. They're useless. Why would a God who specifically designed us humans include parts like that that serve no function? Other ones, like the tailbone, the appendix, gallbladder, and the tiny muscles attached to each hair that give us goosebumps, they're all useless. Or what about parts that do serve a function, maybe even a very necessary one, but do it in a really craptastic way? What about the laryngeal nerve? That's the one that goes from our larynx, goes down into our chest, wraps around part of our heart, one of the most vital organs that really needs to do its work unimpeded, only to then loop back up and go into our brains. Why take that path? It's a much shorter and straighter shot to go right across. I mean, these are just some of the basics of the bad design of not just humans, but basically all biological life have these sorts of malformations or inelegant assemblies. It's because evolution is not a designer, but a tinkerer. Little changes over and over a long period of time end up with a biological mishmash of stuff that works despite it being a total fustercluck.
Then you've got the argument for resurrection. This needs a whole other video, but if Jesus really rose from the dead, then this shows that he must have been God.
The argument from resurrection. All right. Despite the fact that there is disagreement as to whether or not Jesus existed at all as an individual, the only thing close to evidence that a person named Jesus died and then rose from the dead is the Bible itself. And as an atheist, I don't care what it says in your holy book. This is less of an argument for resurrection and more of an argument from authority with the Bible as the authority. Believe it because it's in the Bible, and the Bible must be true because the Bible says that it's true. That is circular reasoning. Christians like to think that just because the Bible says something happened, then that is a guarantee of its truth.
Hey, if you want me to take a dump in a box and mark it guaranteed, I will. I got spare time.
There are tons of arguments against the resurrection of Jesus and the account of Jesus' death and resurrection from the Bible. But that's really all this argument comes down to. The Bible and what it says. So, let me reiterate. I don't care what it says in your holy book.
And finally, what I think is one of the most important arguments, one of the most important proofs, is the argument from personal experience. Ask any Christian how they know that God exists, and they will have their own unique story that they can share with you.
That is the strongest you've got? That's you saving the best for last? Anecdotal accounts? I mean, there's a fallacy in that. I'm almost sure of it. Oh yeah, the anecdotal fallacy. A personal account is not evidence that can be used to convince anyone but yourself. If I told you that I had a personal experience, that I had a vision of universe-belching unicorns in the 8th dimension, that I felt their presence and their peace and their love, I felt their benevolent gastric emissions, and they were so real that I could practically smell them, would you be convinced by that? Should you be convinced by that? A personal account proves nothing other than you believe something happened to you, and this is your perception of it. Well, actually, it doesn't even prove that, because there's always the possibility that the person is just straight up lying. Not even necessarily to you, but they could be lying to themselves. Most atheists who are former theists can tell you about when they believed and how they thought they had had personal experiences of God at the time, but upon later reflection and after ditching the desire to have supernatural or metaphysical experiences, they realized that it was all either a delusion or a misunderstanding of what happened, if indeed anything happened at all. A lot of so-called personal experiences of God can be chalked up to dreams, imagined occurrences, inflated recollections of mundane experiences, or just flat-out self-deceptions. So no, this doesn't exactly work as a strong argument in your favor. And that's all Miss Jackson had to say in the video. So, a bunch of quick-fired, supposed evidences for God's existence, and they were all flawed in one way or another. A lot of fallacies of logic were employed, a lot of false assertions about science or how the universe works, and it seems a lot of flaws with such arguments are routinely overlooked by theist proponents of them out of a desire for them to be right, so you ignore what is so blatantly wrong with them. So nothing new here, nothing convincing here, nothing that hasn't been debunked many, many times before. But since Ms. Jackson made the video for the youth, and since they're less likely to have heard the debunking of these arguments before, there's a greater likelihood she'll be able to fast talk them into assurance of God's existence with these shoddy arguments. That's why they need to be constantly refuted to make sure that there remains a good chance that the youth that she's talking to will also see the counter-arguments and not just exist in an echo chamber of theistic rhetoric. So, thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like this video, comment, and subscribe so you'll always be notified when a new video comes out. Until next time, I'm Professor Plink reminding you to keep striving for greater understanding. It's the best way to get wherever you want to go.